Hi everyone, my name is Lee Walsh. I am a lead solutions engineer here at Katalon, with several years of experience working in the test automation space. This is across several different commercial offerings or vendors. So in short, I've worked with many customers in the Europe region and helped them along their automation journey, which requires a good understanding around what tools and solutions are on the market, what those customers are currently using, and understanding challenges they face, or trying to predict maybe what challenges they may come across and making them aware of that. Okay. Firstly, thank you for joining today's session, which is, as I mentioned, part of our new webinar series. I am conscious that there is a million and one other things you could be doing today, so we appreciate you joining us. And yeah, just a few bits of housekeeping. Last week we discussed Studio Assist and in particular agent mode within Studio Assist. For those that did not attend that session, it was recorded. And for any of our Catalan users, I highly recommend watching it back as it speaks to some really cool new enhancements and MCP integrations, allowing Studio Assist to connect to existing tooling to execute whichever task it has been asked. If you registered, the recording should have been sent to you last week, and the same will happen for today's session. If you did not register, all these sessions will be made available, and last week's can now be found on our website under resources and webinars. For today's session, we will be looking at the Katalon platform and speaking to some open source tooling as comparisons or alternatives. The goal certainly is not to push you away from one or the other, as it really depends on your testing requirements, your team's expertise, current processes, agreements, or restrictions you may have in place, along with several other items that we'll speak to today. Throughout the session, should you have any questions, we can address them at the end via the Q&A feature in Zoom. And we will also like to ask maybe two or three questions as we go through today's session to help understand everyone's current usage and also personalize or customize this conversation over the next 45 minutes or so. Cool. So before we get started, and to keep us on track, we do have a few slides that we will use today. So let's review the agenda and then get started. First, we will discuss the Katalon platform. We certainly won't be able to go through the Katalon platform in a huge amount of detail today, but for customers who are making use of a subset of our offerings, this will help provide additional context to what is possible. We will then speak to some open source offerings, but to be honest, it can be in relation to any sort of tooling you look to make use of. Um, Especially in more recent times, it's so easy to get started with different solutions. And I've happened to me before, it's so enjoyable initially that we may lose track of the problems we are trying to solve and what's really important. Then we will jump into some demonstrations and then close out by detailing where you can find out more about anything we have covered, which is relating to the Katalon platform and so on. So quickly, let's set some context on why AI augmented testing or AI powered testing is becoming so critical for companies. Firstly, companies are now accepting and embracing AI across their business more than ever. This means developers are now better equipped to complete their day-to-day work. We can see some stats here around developer productivity, their ability to release new features faster than ever, and their ability to, in turn, create more code, which requires more testing. To combat that change, Catalan, like many other commercial solutions, are also embracing AI through the use of several AI agents, which is allowing teams to create, maintain, execute tests across various types of applications quicker than ever. Another key component to the Katalon platform is now TrueTest. TrueTest is driven by real user interactions on our applications. And because of this, we now know how our applications are being used versus assuming how they're being used based off requirements and so on. This is both really cool and crucial, as when we've spoke to customers in regards to a unified platform and received feedback from many other sources, A lot of the bugs that are getting into production are simply just flows that we had not thought about, therefore not tested. True test in this example on this slide is linked to a production use case where we identified gaps between our current regression suite and real end user flows, but it can be used in other environments where perhaps developers build out new features, naturally test those features, allowing us to automate those interactions. Or it could be our manual testing team, product experts interacting with our application, all the way to this production example that we see here. Okay. Last slide on the Katalon platform, and then we'll jump into a bit of a demonstration. This slide here, I know there's quite a lot going on here, but this slide is speaking to how Katalon can help throughout the entire software testing lifecycle. This is through different offerings, which are all part of that unified platform. So for many on the call, you may be making use of all of these offerings, but do keep this in mind as we move through today's demonstration. Cool. And with that in mind, just so I get an understanding of maybe everyone's experience with some of these solutions, we will run our first poll and then get started on some open source considerations. So give me 1 second here to kick this off. I believe you should see a poll on your screen now. And this will just help me understand everyone's familiarity with some of these solutions here as we do kind of a comparison to open source. Okay, cool. Predominantly Studio Runtime Engine, a little bit of test ops, no test cloud or true test. Okay, cool. That's good for me. That will help me focus this conversation a little bit. So let me just end the poll. Perfect. Thank you, guys. Cool. So moving into the second part of the agenda, which was open source considerations. So now let's speak to alternatives and key considerations we should be making when we choose any sort of tooling, whether it be a commercial offering or an open source offering. So I have created, if we just move to the next slide, I've created maybe 3 buckets or categories for this slide, but there's much more we could reference. But to make sure we're getting through all the technical items and doing a demonstration, I've tried to simplify this as much as possible. So let's speak to this for a second, and then we'll jump into some of the comparisons that we've built out. So firstly, you can see here, starting from the left-hand side, does this offering meet our needs? Okay, so for applications under tests, when we consider testing our applications, we need to consider the scope and our requirements. At a very high level, we need to consider all types of testing required. Although it may not be possible to test different applications through one single open source offering or conduct different types of testing within that one solution, knowing what is involved will help us better estimate time and effort required for us to confidently test at scale. There may be some applications that take longer to test than others. We may be aware of that. We just need to have that consideration in place because our team's time isn't endless, obviously. At an application level, whether we're conducting manual or automated testing, understanding what happens under the hood of an application is also critical to know how to test it effectively at scale. Um, Maybe some people haven't thought of that on this call, but there might be certain pieces of the application that once you know how it's been built out, you may know that it's likely going to cause you more problems than other parts, and that's where we would need to focus or be aware of. Okay. A key important one here is integrating with our current tech stack as well. Does the offering integrate nicely into our current tech stack? We may also already be using certain tooling, and taking on new offerings can be difficult, especially if they cannot be integrated easily into what we're currently doing or requires a lot of manual intervention. This tends to kind of create silos, which then creates a lot more work for us to do and potential for pieces to be left out across this testing life cycle. Okay, so Check for integrations with both tools you're using now, but also try identify where you are heading based off your goals or your requirements and see if future integrations are covered. And finally, for this category, is this something our entire team will be happy to make use of and will be willing to work with? Okay, from a tech perspective, we will have team members who are more confident with certain approaches, certain frameworks, languages, or team members who need more assistance than others. Teams that have limited coding experience, for example, although the barrier for entry is progressively getting lower, we still need to know how to set up everything and teach people new skills that may be considered hard to learn. Even for more experienced teams, we might have a great team who has a great level of knowledge for writing test cases, but they have little experience in setting up and maintaining an execution environment, as an example. Okay. Into our middle category that we see here is future proofing our investment. Automation can certainly be enjoyable, especially when we're getting started and we're starting to see results. But we need to keep the bigger picture in focus. Features and processes we put in place now will be tested even more as we start to scale. For example, pain we feel when automating or executing a couple of test cases will just become a bigger issue as we scale. This technical pain is also something that we can consider from a financial costs perspective, but we'll leave that as a separate conversation for today. Um, but no, it might be relatively cheap and easy to get started, but over time as we scale, we don't want to be limited or stopped due to ever increasing cost concerns. Okay. Then we also need to consider, is the offering scalable and is it going to continue to head in the direction we hope? Not only do we need to ensure our offering is built to last, but the team around this too. And that can be both our team and the team that are looking after this solution, whether it be open source, a commercial solution, and so on. So for our team, this can be team members who are considered experts or are the only people who can perform certain tasks within that offering. And then, as I said, outside of the team, there are ways for you to check and predict if the potentially chosen solution will be here to last. Um, might be a little bit more difficult for open source solutions. So, for example, it could be contributor activity, it could be a number of feature requests that are against the latest release, it could be staff turnover, it could be sponsorships or funding that's in place, that will obviously make it more likely to last and be supported. It's good if it's working perfect now. You're not looking for a solution just for now. You're looking for a solution that will grow with your testing. Um, Years and years down the road. Cool. Last one here, and then we'll jump into technical pieces is limited support, which is closely linked to future proofing our investment. People are always interested in the latest and greatest, but there may not be much documentation or community support for the latest and greatest. If only a handful of people have started making use of this, although their feedback might be brilliant, there may not be a lot of documentation. So if an issue occurs which affects or pauses an important release, there's a limited safety net, I suppose, in regard to troubleshooting. Nowadays, we certainly have AI agents. We can help fix our issue and we can read as much documentation as we like. Um, but under time pressure, we may need more than this. And these are just three that I've mentioned. I did not add here, but security and compliance will always be a question for any type of offering, whether open source or not. So keep this in mind too, especially as we speak to AI augmented testing. I heard this referenced on a podcast only last week or the week before, and it is certainly a key topic to be uh, thinking of when you're looking at stuff like this. Now, you may have considered all of this and may have an answer to each consideration, which is great if so. This is just to demonstrate that there should be more thought to just downloading something locally and starting to work away, or entering in credit card details to gain access to a commercial offering before getting approvals or understanding what it actually means behind the scenes. Cool. Last slide. Why are teams switching to Catalan? This is just summarizing what we saw there. So if you are thinking of these considerations in regards to a commercial offering, then Again, this slide just highlights some of these items for the Katalon platform. Uh, as most people are using the Katalon platform, we won't go into much detail on this slide as the previous one, but teams of all levels are making use of the Katalon platform. We have support for web, mobile, desktop, and API within the same UI. We have enterprise integrations, which is seen across many commercial offerings, but want to just draw attention to the bottom left item that we may not be aware of, or bottom right, sorry, my apologies. And that is innovation and vision. If you're not aware of Gartner's latest on first Magic Quadrant for AI augmented software testing, Catalan was recognized as a visionary, which is high praise and speaks to everything that we've just discussed. Cool. Let's now jump into a technical demo. So firstly, let's look at, here we are. Cool. Let's look at some options we have from a requirements to a test case perspective. And there's certainly more that we can discuss here, but as the title of the session suggests, we will just do some open source offerings in the Catalan platform. Okay. From a requirements analysis perspective, we may potentially have requirements stored in Jira as user stories. It's important to note that there are both free and paid plans here. And with the free plans, they tend to be limited by size, both in relation to team members and storage capabilities, along with other items we mentioned as considerations earlier. Nonetheless, we can create our user stories, which I'll demonstrate. We'll be able to export them via applying either a basic filter or a JQL query, and then we tend to manually update the test cases and send them back to some test management tool. Okay, again, some will choose to look at a paid solution when they come through this, whether it be third-party paid applications available on the Atlassian marketplace or other commercial offerings. And this is just due to the process tending to be quite time consuming, tedious, and can lead to test artifacts being stored and located in several different locations or solutions or so on. Cool. And then we'll jump over and just look at what this is like in the Katalon platform. So enough of a slide deck for now. After that, we'll look at the automating test cases, but let's come out of here. My example will be Jira in this case. So we may have, as we can see here, we have a whole host of different requirements built out in Jira. Okay, they have a relevant description, they have acceptance criteria, they might have subtasks, they might have linked work items, and so on. Okay, and what we would do is quite simply start to run filters against this to pull all of this information back, export it into a relevant file, open the relevant file, and start to build out our test cases and test steps. Just to show you how easy it is to do that, I have created some basic filters because I just want to show you items only related to the Orange HRM project. So if I just show you a filter here, that's fine. You can select your project. You can select your type being a user story. I want to look at everything that has the status to do. And if I just wanted to look at this for myself, I could easily just come in here and see what has been assigned to myself and maybe start to build out my test cases here by exporting this into a CSV file, Excel sheet, and so on. Okay. So a little bit tedious. You can see if multiple people were doing this, there's a time where this will sit in an Excel sheet and we need to upload it somewhere else. So is a bit of work involved here, but this is how we would tend to do this without looking at maybe plugins or different offerings that are available. Okay. What I'll show you just really quickly is I know someone mentioned they're using test ops. For other people, we do have something like test ops here. Okay. And this is all the different integrations available. So prior to this session, I would have integrated with Jira. I can, and I'll come to a question in a second if that's okay. I have integrated with Jira. I have pulled in all of those different user stories that we saw. Okay. And now you can see my requirement, my acceptance criteria. And if I was to do this just manually, I could now start to create test cases and link them to this requirement. Okay. Or this user story. What we have done in more recent versions is we have our planning agent here as well. So our planning agent allows me to, through AI, generate test cases off of these requirements. On the right-hand side, you'll notice before I even start to generate test cases, it is going to ask me a few questions here. So it's analyzing my requirements and it's flagging or making me aware of anything that's incomplete, unclear, or just needs additional context. Okay. And this can be related to what we see here. I would populate this information. So, for example, who can create work shifts? How many shifts can you work in a day? Should it be a 12-hour format or a 24-hour format? And so on. What we've seen with our customers is this tends to be questions that our team might have, but rather than them asking those questions, they'll make assumptions. And that can over time lead to inaccurate test cases that we're now executing over time. Okay, so this is a cool little feature here that will help us analyze requirements. Once we have analyzed and provided that additional context, we will see this will create uh, several test cases for me. And if we were doing the Excel approach or doing the manual test case approach of writing them out ourselves, it could take us 15 to 30 minutes a test case. Here we have 10 test cases created. I can jump into any of these test cases, provide additional context, ask it to regenerate steps, update test data if I wanted to. So rather than calling it shift A, B, and C, I could change the names. I could say, rather than using Joe Blogs as a person, use this level of test data. And we now have test cases created. Okay. I'll just check to see if there's any questions in the chat box at this point. I know someone did have their hand up. So if they want to pop a message in the chat box or check if there's anything in the Q&A. Cool. And as we wait for that question to come true, I'll just finish off this example here. So I do have the webinar chat and the Q&A box open on my other screen if anyone does want to ask a question at this point. But you can see here, we have 10 test cases created. I could save them all at this point. And once I've saved them all, what I will have is I will have manual test cases that we may want to execute over time, but then over time decide to say, let's automate against them. Okay. And this is the first test step here. If we go back to our example, if people are doing this and working off requirements, you will tend to take your requirements, turn them into manual test cases, and then look to automate them, which I'll show you now how you can do in different offerings, basically. Cool. I don't see a question. Maybe that. Oh, what is that? Yes. What is the accuracy in terms of test cases generated and has 100% coverage? Um, so we need to be transparent here. So um, we'll look at this as an accelerator. So I can show you, or we can share documentation, and we've written documentation on how you should be handling the requirements, what level of information you need to be able to maybe see that requirements analysis piece list where it asks for additional context. Okay. Um, so we can share that with you, but think of this as even if it was to generate 60 or 70% of the test cases that I have or I want to, that level of acceleration that we're getting here, again, if we look at it as a 15-minute to 30-minute comparison to create one test case, maybe those 10, maybe six of them require additional work, or maybe two of them require additional work. The other eight or four or whatever the case is, if they have been accelerated, that is 30 minutes of test case. That's 2 hours worth of time that we've just saved by watching this session here. Okay. So you saw in less than a minute, we were able to create that level of detail. So we can post this call, share that documentation, and also the workings of that model that's behind the scenes there as well. Okay, cool. Let me just say we've answered both of those. Cool. Let's take it on a further step. Okay. So a really interesting part, something that's a lot of people maybe start writing test cases, really enjoy that process, and then they start to hit issues when it comes to scale, or there is manual testing teams that maybe struggle with the automation piece and more complex examples, and that's where we kind of have this conversation as well. So once we have created our test cases, we can now look to automate these test cases over time. From an open source perspective, we have different IDEs we can install and different automation frameworks we can choose. There is and there are tons of resources available online comparing these to each other. So we won't go into that today, which is the likes of Selenium versus Playwright versus Cypress. But if you are interested in finding out more, a quick Google search will give you a vast number of blogs and podcasts to review for today. And just due to kind of current popularity, I'll use Playwright, which has some cool features, which I'll show you guys. And then I'll review the Katalon platform where we have several approaches, depending on your needs or preferences. Okay. So let's switch over to Playwright here. So to get to this point, I have installed my IDE. I have created a blank project, and then I have installed Playwright. I know that's quite a lot to take in. So let me just, do I have, yes, let me just come out of here. Playwright, here we go. So to install Playwright, I've followed the steps that we can see here. We can also see the prompts that we would receive and what would be created. And it's important to read up on this prior to installing, as once installed, there are several things for us to be aware of. Okay. And I'll show you some of those now, but you can see here, it will tell me what's been installed, different binaries and so on. It will tell me how to run test cases, but we still need to understand this project structure to be able to make full use of it. So let's jump into my IDE. And I have some test cases created. I'll show you how we created them in a second. But if we look at the left-hand side here, the likes of our package.json, our node modules, and playwright config file, these are all items that we should read up on because this is key to controlling a lot of different things that we do within the project. Okay. Then to start creating tests, we need to install relevant modules and dependencies. For example, the Playwright test runner that we see here. Once we have installed the Playwright test runner, we can now start to define tests and receive Playwright fixtures injected by the runner. Okay, and we'll look at some different examples. The first is creating a test case by line. Okay, so this is a test case that I've created by line of code. So you can see we'll need to understand these lines of code. But if we move down to here, we're going to the Orange HRM application. We're going to interact with a particular element on a page. We're going to fill in that text box, okay, with Lee Walsh, with a particular password. And then we're going to assert that we see invalid credentials and then close out the browser. Okay. One thing I will say is obviously when we're writing lines of code like this, we will need to know how to interact with the objects on the page. There are different plugins or extensions that are available. So if I jump back to Orange HRM, for example, this is the application I want to test. If I inspect the page, you can install the likes of selectors hubs or crow paths, which will be able to get you that information here. We'll still want to understand this over time, but if I'm building out my test case and I'm not familiar with locator strategies, I can make use of a plugin or an extension like we see here to start populating this test case. Okay, so let's jump back to what we see here this way. And that's what I've done. Okay, so you'll need to understand what we've done here. One thing I'll also mention is the async that we see here, or the await. Okay, as I've chosen to use JavaScript, my test steps will execute asynchronously unless we have called this out, which I have. Okay, so what does that mean for people maybe that haven't used something like this? The example is we could try click on a particular button before the page is loaded, or we could try validate or verify that we see invalid credentials before this action has been completed. Okay, so that would be the asynchronous approach that we need to kind of update here. But once we're aware of that, it should be straightforward, but these are things that we just need to be aware of as we go along here. Okay, so this is writing lines of code. What I will show you here is we also have the ability to use record and playback. Not available in every open source solution, okay, but I could go to CodeGen, okay, so code generator, record and playback functionality. Say I want to go to Orange Katalon. I'm just going to minimize so hopefully it appears on the one screen. Give it a second to load up. Okay, I'll move this over because it's appeared on my other screen. Yeah, so this is record and playback here. Again, not available in every solution out there, but you can see as I start to click on particular fields, for people that are familiar with Katalon Studio, you'll be familiar with this process. And there we have a test case created, and I can, let's say, assert that we see, I believe this is it, assert that element contains text when we're looking for invalid credentials. Okay, so now we have up here, we've created a first test case. I can go and copy this information, okay, and then paste it in like we see here. Okay, so that is what I've done in the second example. You'll notice there's some slight differences between my test cases. So for example, we have two test steps here, while I have one to do the same, okay? But still gives us that record and playback functionality. So slight differences, we might want to optimize this afterwards so that we don't have as many test steps and it's easier to read. But we do have record and playback functionality here, okay? Some differences between that on Katalon Studio, I'll show you in a second. But for example, there's no kind of set encrypted text field here. And also what's important is with Katalon Studio, we make use of an object repository, which gives you that page object model approach. So for example, if I was to use record and playback like I did there and use it 100 times, and we had to go through the login process each time, if my test case or my login flow changed, I would have to update that across all of my test cases unless I started to build out a page object model approach. Okay, so by default, we don't get that. But what we could do is, which kind of nullifies or means that we have to do a bit of work after this, we could start to create page objects within my project. So I've created a login page, a constructor, and here's how I interact with all of these different objects or elements on that page. That then means when I come into my test case again, I can just call it like this rather than having to update this across all of my test cases. Okay. There is self-healing abilities and so on, but let's say we had to check a box before we clicked login. I would need to go to all my test cases and do that here if I wasn't using some sort of approach like this. So I'll show you the difference in Studio and it will become more clear. But this is just an example here. Okay. Last thing I'll show you, because when I go to execute this, I want to execute this across different browsers and so on. That is controlled in my Playwright config file or in the command that I pass through here. And these are all bundled up browsers that are kind of added to the Playwright package, okay? So here, if I wanted to start executing, I would run npx playwright test, which is only going to run this test for me here because I have it set to say test only. But when I go and run this here, it's going to execute that one test case for me that we saw. And there's the invalid credentials, and it has passed because it has verified invalid credentials for me. Okay. As I said, there's many different offerings out here. It could be Selenium, could be Cypress, could be, if we're looking at native app, could be different languages or frameworks there as well. But this is just to give you an idea of how we would do something similar on some of the features, not all of the features. We don't have time to go through all of the features, but this just gives you an example. And you may say, okay, this is actually something that we could do or something that some of the teams are doing, but there is a certain level of kind of technical know-how or at least confidence that we need to have to be able to start doing this and maintaining these over time. Cool. If we look at a comparison, and I'll check to see if anyone has any questions. So as we go through this, if anyone has any more questions around that, just let me know. But everyone is seeing this, but let's just kind of do a comparison or make people aware. So when we jump into Katalon Studio, record and playback is the first example that I'll show you. So let me just minimize this so we have it all on one screen. I'll record through our recorder, navigate to the URL that I want to go to. And once I click record, it will open up the browser for me, navigate to the URL. And just like we saw earlier, I can now start to enter in my information. I can log in, and then I can do a little bit more from a verifying or assertions here. But let me just verify element text, close out my browser. And now we have the same test case that we saw, okay? Some slight differences, as I mentioned, where setting encrypted text on that password field. And also, I didn't have to understand how to interact with all of these different objects. And finally, when I go to save this test case, it's being saved to our object repository, which, as I mentioned earlier, means that if we update this one locator, okay, so let's say over time, the username or the password field changes. If I go to a test case and I update the password field in one location, being our object repository, it's updated across all of my test cases. Okay. We didn't look at some more complex examples, but let's say I have a whole host of test cases that all use the login flow. Very simply, in Katalon Studio, you have that click and drag kind of motion. So I can just call test cases like this if I want to start. Let's call a test case. Let's call employee search after. So let's log in, search for a particular employee, and then let's just close the browser. And you can see in kind of 3 clicks and moving my mouse around, I've been able to create a test case here. So a lot of Katalon Studio users on the call, this is a way, there's several different ways for you to kind of create repeatable steps. And one is by calling test cases, as we see here. Okay. Also, if we want to start reading from different data files, so we want to do data-driven testing. If I just don't save this test case because it's not important. But if I come in here, I can have my values hard-coded. In this example, I've quite simply just used global variables instead. So if I wanted to point to multiple different environments with the same test case, we can easily do that. And then the last piece is if I wanted to start binding to different data sheets, we could do this through that tab, which is very easy as well. Okay, so if I wanted to execute this test case and use 5 different user credentials, I could easily create a variable and bind to that variable based off of any of the data files that I've created. Okay, and this is all nice, easy to use, easy to manage, easy to maintain. Okay, so it could be Excel sheets, CSV files, it could be relational database connections. And if I jump in here, let's go into this, for example, a whole host of different fake usernames. If I wanted to use the first 5 rows here, I could easily mention that in a test case. And let me just show you that example to tie this all together. Okay, so if I jump in here and I go into test suite, let's see, where is that example? Employee search. You can bind at a test case level or a test suite level. Here you can see I'm binding at a test suite level. Point to my CSV file that we saw, iterate through the first 5 rows, and I want to tie the full name variable to full name 2 in that sheet that we saw earlier. Okay, so nice, easy examples here. If you're not doing some of these and you're interested in doing that, do let us know. We can certainly schedule in sessions where we can go through this with you and your team as well. Cool. Let me see if there's any questions or comments in the chat box so far. No? Oh, let me check the Q&A. I see that there might be something in the Q&A. Okay, cool. Okay, nothing in the Q&A at the moment. Cool. Let's just build on this example a little bit further, and then we'll look at some other open source comparisons. So when we look at this here, we've shown you how to create test cases through IDE, and in this case, Playwright. Um, it is different for other frameworks as well, so just keep that in mind. But also, I've shown you how to use Katalon Studio. For a lot of people, when we asked that question earlier, they weren't making use of TrueTest, and they weren't making use of test ops, and maybe you haven't started using Studio Assist. So let me just really quickly show you an example of those, which is certainly, if you haven't used Studio Assist before, I recommend checking last week's session. But let me just show you an example for Studio Assist. And I'm just going to copy a code snippet. Studio Assist in later versions of Katalon Studio has an additional mode here as well. Okay, so it has agent mode. Previously, if you've been using it, you could come in here and say, hey, tell me about Test Cloud, because nobody on the call has any familiarity with Test Cloud. It will go get that information for me. I ask it a question, it executes that task. Okay, so it tells me what Test Cloud is. In later versions of Studio Assist, we now have agent mode, which is powered by MCP. So it now has the ability to actually go and create test cases for me, update test cases in bulk. So for an example would be, let me put a description against all of my test cases. Let me update my system.outPrint commands to web UI comments, which will be better for reporting. Okay. It also has the ability to pull the latest documentation. So if I ask it a question today, it will get me the latest documentation. But if I ask it a question in 2 weeks' time and we've updated documentation or released new features, it will also be able to get you that. Okay. And then finally, it will also we'll now allow you to integrate with remote or external MCP servers. So remember when we looked at Jira earlier, we can now pull any of that information into Katalon Studio. So I could get the list of acceptance criteria. I could get any of those Jira stories that were assigned to me in the latest sprint. And now I can start automating against them all through the same UI. Okay. The reason why I show you guys this is it's not a Studio Assist session, although we could certainly do one. I'll just show you an example where I can just put in a prompt here, get the relevant test objects from my object repository, create a Katalon Studio test case called employee login, and here's the test steps that I want you to do. It will go check my object repository for me. So if I have test cases created that interact with these objects already, it will create a test case for me, get the test case, create the test case, get the objects, and there we have it. We have a test case here that could be tied to real objects that we've interacted with. And now we have an executable test case ready to go. Okay. So this is just an example of another way that we can accelerate test case creation and test case maintenance. And I could also go and take it one step further. Let's say we have all our test cases created for now. I want to just add a detailed description to all of my test cases, which will help new team members as they join. But I can ask it to do something like this, and it's going to go and update my test case for me. So from a creation standpoint and also a maintenance standpoint, this can help. And if I just refresh again, and let me just come in here and open this up. Go into properties. I now have a detailed description. Okay. You can see it's been created through Studio Assist with the Gen AI tag. Okay. Basic examples, but just want to make you aware of that. Since we are talking about test creation and test maintenance here, just know Studio Assist has become even more powerful now that it has the agent mode and the ability to interact with a whole host of different internal servers or external servers, sorry, that you might have. Okay. If you want to find out more, definitely look at last week's session that's now available. Or we can look at that in more detail if you wish to do this with your team members as well. Cool. Last thing I want to show you guys from a test creation standpoint is TrueTest, which is a based off of the poll earlier, is something that people wouldn't have a lot of familiarity with. So if I just go to my Orange HRM application again, what I can do is I can create a TrueTest agent, add the TrueTest agent to my application, like we see here. So we would hand this to our developers. They would add it to the application. And then on the next release, we would have TrueTest installed here. And what that allows us to do is track user interactions. Okay, so again, if you remember our examples earlier, it could be developers in a particular environment building out new features and testing those new features as they build them out. It could be our manual testing team or product experts, where we're not asking them to do anything additional to what they're doing right now, but we're automating off the back of it. Or it could be production use case where we want to compare to our current test suite or our current regression suite to what's happening on our application. Once we have that plugged in, you can see we start to generate journey maps for whatever time period you want. And here is a list of different user flows. And this is the map that's associated with it. Okay. So each of the squares or rectangles that we see here are effectively pages on our applications. I can check to see traffic volume. And as the orange HRM example is for predominantly clocking in and clocking out or punching in and punching out for work, you can see that they're the most traveled user flows. Okay, there's more people clocking in and clocking out than looking at other employees or submitting performance reviews or looking for time off. And what I can do is I can look at the test steps, very similar to what we will see in Katalon Studio. And I can go and ask it to generate these test cases for me. Okay, so you can see here we've generated test cases before. So I can go and generate test cases. And just to tie off this example, let me show you a true test project. This is a true test project. The test cases that we just saw are all here. And you can see very similar to what you would see if you use record and playback. Okay. Difference is we're taking a screenshot after each action, which makes it look like there's more steps here. But we have a test case that's ready to go once we just update the variable information. Okay. So from a security and compliance perspective, we're not going to collect the user input for sensitive information. So all you would need to do at this point is update the variables. And now you have an executable test case ready to go, which could have come from more than just the testing team as well. Okay, so this is a very cool and new way to accelerate test creation and maintenance. And there's also other cool features that we can do, which is we can start to analyze coverage gaps. So compare what we have in production to QA and make sure that there's no gaps that could be leaking into bugs that are getting into production, as an example. Okay. Um, Obviously, we can do a much deeper session on true test as well, but just wanted to make you guys aware of that there as well. Because when we do speak to the test creation piece, there are several different offerings here depending on your requirements, the applications you're testing, and so on. Okay. Cool. Last thing I'd like to call out here is obviously, remember a lot of what I've shown you on the left here, we can do for multiple applications. On the right, we may be able to do web and API, for example, with one framework or one open source solution. If we're looking to do mobile desktop, we now need to start looking at other offerings as well. And that's where that complexity starts to increase because we're asking teams to learn multiple different solutions to hit all of the requirements that we're looking to execute against. Cool. Let me check to see if we have any questions there. Let me use Catalan for what changed in code. Okay, so so just in case people don't see the Q&A box, how can we use Catalan for what changed in code and to be tested means impacted areas of testing, etc. So good question. I'll answer that in a few different ways. So um, if we go into Katalon Studio, because we'll start here because most people are using this. If you're not familiar with the self-healing capabilities that we have, if any of those objects that we're interacting with change, we will have, sorry, I've opened up the same project. If any of those objects that we're interacting with change, we also have the ability to use self-healing. And in later versions of Catalan, we have AI self-healing. So right now, if you look at a test case, we have a whole host of different objects that we're interacting with. And we have a whole host of different locator strategies that we can use. in later versions of Katalon Studio that are coming out imminently, we will be also able to go and recollect this information for you at runtime, which means that this list will all automatically be updated as well. So that's something that will be coming out in a later version of Katalon. So keep an eye out for that. So one way of doing it in Katalon Studio. The other way is if I go back to true test and just show you a true test example. Uh, Journey maps. We'll go into true test. Here we have a status against any of the user flows that we see here. We have stable and new. So stable is when the user flow hasn't changed between a previous journey map. So let's say we collected this user flow last week. We collect it again this week. Nothing has changed. So it's a stable flow. New is when we haven't collected it before and it's now visible. Okay. So initially everything would be new in our first journey map. But then over time as well, if these start to change based off test steps and how we interact with them, and a few other things based off the true test agent, they will start showing up as impacted as well. So that's how you would start to understand if there's differences here. And then you can maintain your test cases from here as well. So that's how you would tackle the maintenance piece. If any of these change over time based off of real user interactions on your application, the status will show up as impacted and you can go and update that test case then off the back of that. Okay. I hope that answers that question. Okay, perfect. It helps. If you do want to find out anything more in relation to that, certainly feel free to reach out to any of the Katalon colleagues or myself. We can kind of dive deeper into that in a separate session, just with yourself, or maybe turn it into a webinar series and so on, if that's something that we need to do. Cool. Let me just mark those as done so I can stay on top of that. Cool. Let's check how we're doing for time. Okay, we are coming close to the end, so I'm actually going to start flying through some pieces here. So apologies. Um, let's look at two things here. So two more pieces just in regards to open source. I don't want to go over time. I want to be conscious and respectful for everyone's time here. So two pieces that I want to speak to as well. We have shown you how to create test cases, which is really cool. You've done it through Katalon, the various offerings. Maybe you've used an open source solution before. Now what you want to do is start executing them. And people will think about executing them as executing it locally on my browser. But if we start to create thousands of test cases, we want to execute on a schedule via our CI/CD pipeline, we now need to start creating machines or agents to start executing against. Okay. A common example of some pain that people would see here is everyone's using Windows machines. We want to execute against Safari. A little bit of a complexity, a little bit of an issue there. We need to acquire Mac OS, maybe purchase some of those machines, maybe find this open source offering. And then when we look at mobile, we may need to start looking at spinning up a Selenium grid, which is certainly complex. I've worked with companies where that is kind of their flagship offering. You might be creating Linux machines, installing Docker, trying to install many different emulators and simulators. And the even worse part is you do a great job in getting all of that up and running. In 2 weeks' time, another browser version comes out. In a month's time, a new iPhone is released, and so on. So the market and the devices and OS combinations are constantly changing here. And this is where some of the pain comes in. Okay, so you can spin up all the infrastructure you want to start doing that. You need to start maintaining that environment. And that in itself can be quite requires a high level of knowledge and expertise from a architecture perspective, and then also needs to be maintained constantly as well. If I know a lot of people haven't seen Test Cloud, and we are running short on time, but know that we do have an offering called Test Cloud, which is giving you access to a whole host of real devices. Okay, so for example, for desktop browsers, I have Windows, Mac OS, various Mac OS versions, various Windows versions, different browsers and browser versions available here. And I could go and say, okay, let's go and start a session on the latest Mac OS, the latest Chrome version. And now I can start to manually test my application against this real device. Okay. On top of that, we have a whole host of features as well, like IP geolocation. So how does my website behave in different locations, maybe language settings change. We have the ability to upload, download files, and a whole host of other features here from accessibility and so on. Okay. The point that we're trying to make here is if you were to look at maybe mobile browser to emulate this and have this yourself in real physical devices, you can imagine how much each would cost here. Then you need to make sure you give everyone access to that. This is a very time consuming and costly effort. We can give you access to this, not just in a manual fashion, but also from your test automation. So you do a great job in creating all your test cases in Studio. You can now start to go and point them to Test Cloud and start executing against that Test Cloud environment. Okay. And all that information will be stored in executions here and various reports that you get back. Okay. So we won't be able to dive into it just based off of time here, but just something to be aware of. Maybe we'll cover it in a separate session. And then the last piece, I know we had a few test ops users. After all of this and we start to execute, we may want to start looking at how we're doing rather than just a single execution, how we're doing over the last sprint, the last release, the last 10,000 test cases we've created or executed. And that's something we can also do in test ops, okay, where I can go from maybe a 30,000 foot view to be able to spot gaps, opportunities, trends for improvements, and so on. Okay, so I can apply various filters here to go from maybe 1,000 test cases down to a handful of test cases, identify common issues, common automation errors, and start to address the low hanging fruit as per se. Okay, various dashboards here, all built off some of the reports that we have. So all customizable. And here's the various reports that you can have that you can run for any time period. Okay, cool. Apologies, we have to go through that quite quickly. And the last things that I want to mention is just from a resources perspective, we have a whole host of resources available here from documentation to the Katalon Academy, to our community and so on, and free webinars like this today. So do check out all of these that we see here. Examples of some of the videos that are available as well. So if you do want to find out more at your own pace, feel free to make use of any of these resources. And if you need any assistance, you can reach out to the team here as well. If you're interested in all of the AI components that we haven't gotten through all of them today for sure. There is a new AI course free for you to go and sign up for and complete. And will get you a very good understanding of what's available from an AI perspective, which is that AI empowered testing or powered testing. Cool. I know we had to rush through the last few bits. I can stay on for a few minutes if anyone has any additional questions or comments. If anyone is interested in the Test Cloud piece or the advanced reporting, we'll certainly cover that in more detail for you. But yeah, we had a lot to cover today. So yeah, thank you for everyone for joining. I can stay on for a few minutes if there's any questions or comments, and then we can go from there. Cool. Looks like just thank yous. Perfect. And let's just see if there's anything in the Q&A box.